Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. Today's episode is about power and how power affects the environment and environmental policy. Let's think first about how power enters into the calculations that economists do when they make recommendations about environmental policy on the basis of cost-benefit analysis. These recommendations are based supposedly on what's efficient for the society. And one might think that what's efficient wouldn't have a lot to do with how power is distributed in the society, but it turns out there's one kind of power that's absolutely central to the neoclassical economist definition of what's efficient, and that's purchasing power. Willingness to pay, and hence ability to pay, underpins the valuation of environmental benefits and environmental harms in the shadow markets, as they're called, of cost-benefit analysis, just like in the regular markets of real life. So when people have a lot of purchasing power, they have a lot more voice in determining what gets produced in a market economy and what gets consumed. And also, it turns out they have a lot more voice in cost-benefit analysis in determining what is judged to be the efficient level of environmental protection. Apart from purchasing power, which enters into those prescriptions about what ought to be done by neoclassical economists, there's another kind of power that's real important in the way societies actually make their decisions. And that's a set of types of power that are sometimes called political power. These include decision power, the power to prevail in contests over what we should decide to do. Agenda power, the power to decide what's the agenda. If you keep things off the agenda, then you don't even have to worry about decision power. They include value power, the power to influence other people's values and preferences so that even if something's on the agenda and they've got decision power, they're going to decide what you'd like them to decide. And they include event power, the power to simply alter the facts on the ground and present people with a fait accompli. These forms of power are called political power, and although they don't enter into the prescription of what should be done in the eyes of neoclassical economists, they enter into the real world in terms of what actually does happen. One way to bring these other kinds of power into the picture is by means of something I'm going to call the power-weighted social decision rule. The power-weighted social decision rule is not a prescription of what should be done. It's not like cost-benefit analysis in that way, but it's a description of what actually happens. Cost-benefit analysis is what's called a normative rule. It's a rule that says this is what we should do, this is what we ought to do, whereas the power-weighted social decision rule is a descriptive rule. It's a description of what actually happens. It's what philosophers call a positive statement about the way the world is, not about the way the world should be. Let's go back to the neoclassical prescription for a minute. One way to very simply express this in a mathematical formula is to say efficiency means maximizing something. It means maximizing net benefits to everyone in society. So if we denote those benefits to each individual as B sub I, if B is greater than 0, it means the person's coming out ahead. If B is less than 0, it means the person's coming out behind. They're bearing net costs, right? Maximizing those net benefits means just summing up the benefits to each individual in the society, the benefits and costs. That's that summation sign there, the Greek sigma. And that's the objective. That's the rule in neoclassical economics in its cost-benefit prescription for what ought to be done, including how much ought to be done, for example, to protect the environment, to protect clean air, for example. It asks the question, well, how much is it worth to protect the air? How much would people be willing to pay for cleaner air? And how much is it going to cost to protect the air? Let's weigh those up and decide what's the efficient level of clean air. The power-weighted social decision rule is kind of like that. Only instead of weighing up net benefits to each individual, as if all individuals' benefits count the same, instead those benefits are filtered, and they're filtered by the power of the individual to whom the benefit or cost accrues. So in this case, if we use that Greek pi sign to denote the power of each individual, the rule becomes not maximize net benefits, but maximize the power-weighted net benefits. The net benefits, that is to say, positive and negative benefits and costs to each individual weighed by the power of those individuals. So in an extreme case where a person had no power, how much would the benefits and cost to them figure into the social decisions that are being made? The answer, of course, is zero. The benefits and cost of those folks wouldn't enter into the decision at all because they don't have any power to make those benefits or costs visible, as it were, in the making of social decisions, including government decisions about whether or not and how much to protect the environment. How does political power enter into environmental policy? Well, there are a number of different ways. Let me just give you a few examples. One is control of the scientific agenda. There are a lot of uncertainties about environmental impacts, a lot of uncertainties about the hazards of various chemicals in our environment, for example, and what information gets created, what research is done, how that information is produced and disseminated is something that can be influenced by the distribution of power. Another way that power can come into the picture is that even when we have some information, there's often what sometimes is called a hard numbers problem, a problem of deciding exactly what the right answer is, because different studies come up with conflicting results. And so one of the ways in which that problem of fuzziness of data ends up being resolved in practice is that decision makers pick numbers that look attractive to those with the power to make their voices heard. Another way that power enters into the picture is through what's called regulatory politics. Analysts who are deciding what should be done or shouldn't be done, whether it's in the name of efficiency or safety or sustainability or justice. These folks they're human beings and they're vulnerable to the exercise of power. They don't want people to get mad at them. They don't want their bosses to get mad at them. They don't want the political appointees who run their agencies to even know what they're deciding. So if they're making decisions that are going to attract a lot of flack, they're going to be a little worried about it. That's regulatory politics. And finally, there's the phenomenon called paralysis by analysis, which is that if the regulators, if say the Environmental Protection Agency makes a decision or tries to make a decision about what should be done, those decisions can be challenged. They can be challenged in the legal system. They can be challenged in court. And sometimes it can take years and years and years to resolve these challenges, during which time the regulatory process has been paralyzed. An example of this kind of power is the history of an area in Louisiana that goes down from Baton Rouge to along the Mississippi River down to New Orleans called Cancer Alley. And they call it Cancer Alley because there's so many cases of cancer in that particular location. And the reason there's so many cases of cancer is almost surely because this region has so many really heavy-duty industrial facilities that emit a lot of air and water pollution. Cancer Alley is an area that's inhabited, above all, mainly by low-income folks, many of them African Americans. And when the state of Louisiana decided they were going to site all these facilities here and give big tax breaks to the corporations to get them to do so, including permanent exemptions from paying any local taxes to help support the communities in which these facilities are located. The folks in whose communities these things were being installed, many of them couldn't even vote. This was before the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. Many of these folks, these low-income African American folks, couldn't even vote. What was their power to influence the decision? It was approximately zero. And so they were presented with these facts on the ground, and it turns out bodies in the ground as well. Let's depict how this stuff plays out if we use the kinds of diagrams you see in economic textbooks. Here's the diagram that you see most often, the prescription of benefit cost analysis, which says what's the efficient level of environmental degradation. Why, it's the level where the marginal costs of degrading the environment, that's the rising line, and the marginal benefits of degrading the environment, that's the declining line. It's where they cross, right? Beyond that point, the cost of degrading the environment would exceed the benefits of degrading the environment, according to the valuations put on these things, based on cost-benefit analysis, based in turn on willingness to pay, based in turn on people's ability to pay for things like clean air or not having big petrochemical plants next door to them. That's the prescription that comes out of benefit cost analysis. I've done one thing here that's a little bit different from the way you normally see it in the textbooks, which I've noticed that the costs and benefits aren't just floating around out there in outer space. Some folks bear net costs, some folks get net benefits, and so what I've called the marginal cost here is the marginal cost to those who lose, those who bear net costs, and the marginal benefits are the benefits to those who win, those who get net benefits. What happens if we then bring power into the picture and look at the power-weighted social decision rule and how that affects not what the prescription is for what's the efficient level of pollution, but instead affects what actually happens in the world, right? So here we are back with the cost-benefit prescription, and now we're going to consider a case where those who benefit from the environmental degrading activities are relatively powerful. What do I mean by those who benefit? Could be the firms, the polluters, that are making more money because they don't have to internalize these costs of pollution, they don't have to install pollution control equipment, et cetera, et cetera. To some extent, some of those benefits could also be passed on to consumers of the firm's products, insofar as that enables the firm to sell more cheaply than it would be able to if it had to internalize those costs of pollution, et cetera. So one situation we can think of is where those folks are relatively powerful, and those who bear the costs are relatively powerless. They may have no power at all, or they may have a little bit of power, but their power to make the costs upon them visible to the decision makers, to make those costs matter in terms of what governments and societies decide to do, is limited, right? So what happens when we bring that power into the situation? Well, here's what happens to the costs. The power-weighted costs to those who lose don't take as much space, so to speak, in the decision makers' calculations. They're diminished, they're muted by the relatively low power of the folks who are bearing the costs. And the benefits to those who gain from the environmentally degrading activity, to the firms or to the consumers, those benefits get bumped up because they're the relatively powerful folk in the society. And in that situation, the actual level of environmental degradation that we're going to predict based on the power-weighted social decision rule, we're not saying this is what should happen, we're saying this is what does happen. That level of environmental degradation goes up. It goes up beyond that optimum prescribed by neoclassical economics on the basis of just purchasing power to an actual level that reflects not only purchasing power, but also political power. Let's consider an alternative scenario, a hypothetical scenario. Maybe there are some examples of this in the real world too. This is a scenario where the folks who benefit from an activity that degrades the environment don't have that much power. And the folks who are harmed by it, who bear the costs, are relatively powerful. What happens in that case? Well, conversely, what we can get here is a situation where the costs are bumped up in the eyes of the decision makers by the fact that the people who are complaining, the people who bear those costs, are relatively powerful. And the benefits to the folks who actually benefit from the activities that degrade the environment, and there must be some people who do that, otherwise those activities wouldn't take place, those benefits get muted in the eyes of the decision maker. And in that case, you could have the outcome, which seems sometimes environmentalists don't even like the phrase, but what one might call it is too little environmental degradation. That is to say, situations where the actual level of environmental degradation is less than at least what neoclassical economists would prescribe as the optimum. Hypothetically, you could have situations like that too. And the question we want to think about is which is more widespread? Which kind of distortions from the exercise of political power are more likely to affect what kinds of environmental policies we actually get? Are we likely to get too much environmental degradation as a result of the exercise of political power and the way it affects environmental policy? Or are we likely to get too little? Well, To think about that question, we need to think about how the benefits and costs of environmentally degrading activities are distributed in relation to the power of the people on both sides of that equation, both on the winning side and on the losing side. The benefits, as I mentioned, go to firms and go to consumers insofar as the lower costs of production get passed along to them. So the question then becomes, well, what kind of people are we talking about here? And in general, we know that the ownership of firms, the ownership of corporate stocks, the executive positions at the tops of those firms, etc., those folks, the folks who benefit by virtue of the benefits of the firms, tend to be relatively well-off people. Those things tend to be concentrated amongst the more affluent sectors of our society. And on the cost side, well, we'll come back to that in a second. I should mention first, though, on the consumer side, if all these kinds of benefits of not having to regulate pollution get passed on to consumers, in general, we're going to see a situation then where those who consume more benefit more. The more you consume, the more of that pollution subsidy, so to speak, gets passed along to you. The subsidy being the fact that you don't have to pay for the costs of pollution embodied in the stuff you're consuming. And so those who consume more benefit more. And who are the folks who consume more? Again, it's the folks at the upper levels of the income and expenditure distribution, the relatively affluent folks. So both on the production side and on the consumption side, the benefits are going to be concentrated on the top. And even if the costs of environmentally degrading activities were distributed totally randomly across the population, even if there was no systematic way in which low-income people or less powerful people, minorities, for example, were being disproportionately impacted by those costs, just on the benefit side, you'd have a situation where you know that the beneficiaries are going to tend to be relatively powerful vis-a-vis everyone else. And the scales, therefore, are going to tilt towards a situation where you're going to have people who are more powerful as the beneficiaries, and the result being more environmental degradation than the neoclassical economist would have prescribed. Insofar as power and wealth are positively correlated, which is not a bad first approximation of what goes on in the world, we can therefore make the prediction that cases of the first type I described, the type where political power results in too much environmental degradation, even by the prescriptive standards of neoclassical economics, those situations are going to be more common than the reverse. So on the basis of the power-weighted social decision rule, we can make two predictions. We can make two hypotheses. The first has to do with the direction of environmental harms. We can imagine that as a result of power, the environmental costs are going to be distributed disproportionately towards those who have less power, less purchasing power to affect what neoclassical cost-benefit analysis would prescribe, and also less political power to make the cost to them visible in the eyes of decision-making. And that is a prediction that is often borne out by studies in the field of environmental justice, which is the topic of another video. The second prediction is that where power disparities are greater in societies where there is a bigger distance between the power of those on top and the power of those on the bottom, you're going to get more environmental degradation. Where those who benefit have a lot of power compared to those who are harmed by environmental degradation, we're going to get more of it. Now, this whole story about power may seem kind of dispiriting. After all, it's a story about how the real world operates, which is pretty far from the story about all of us having an equal vote and equal say and dispassionate, neutral decision makers deciding what's the best thing to do in society. If you believe that's the way society worked, I'm sorry to disillusion you, but the reality is that isn't the way that societies typically work. Power has a lot to do with the way they work. And you might think, well, that's kind of a depressing story, but there's an optimistic piece of this story too, and I want to end on that, which is that power is something that is distributed the way that we all decide, in effect, to distribute it. Power balances in society can be changed. The reason why we don't have slavery anymore in this country is because power balances changed. The reason why women can vote in this country, That started about 100 years ago. That was because power balances changed. The reason we even have an Environmental Protection Agency in this country is because power balances changed. So the fact that power influences what actually happens shouldn't make us feel despair. It should make us feel energy. Energy to go out there and try to change the situation, which people are doing every day all over this country and all around the world. I'll stop there.